Arizona Territory, 1879. The wind carried dust and whispers through the scorched bones of the land, and in the town of Dry Creek, they whispered about her. They say she lost both her children on the same day, someone muttered behind a whiskey glass. They say she cursed her own womb, another answered, spitting into the dirt. None of them said it loud enough for her to hear, but Beatrice Fallow heard it anyway. She stood in the doorway of the old schoolhouse turned church, her dark skirt catching the dry breeze. Her face was pale beneath the sun, hair pinned back with the kind of care that suggested habit, not hope. She kept to herself, never spoke unless spoken to, and never lingered anywhere long. She had arrived 6 months ago with nothing but a carpetbag and 2 worn shoes, and within days the stories had started. Beatrice heard them all. She just never answered. Her boys had been 5 and 2, Zeke and Zion. They died during the crossing from Texas when fever swept through the wagon train, and the trail boss buried 20 children in a week. Her husband had died the month before from a crushed rib and a crushed spirit. Since then, she had wandered west with nothing left but the echo of their laughter, and the ache of holding no one. The town called her a curse, said women who got too close lost pregnancies, said crops withered if she walked past. Beatrice did not argue. She just worked cleaning laundry for the boarding house, sweeping floors at the church. She avoided the saloon and never looked a man in the eye. That was until the cowboy came. It was a Sunday when he rode into town on a lean chestnut gelding, dust clinging to his boots and sun in his hair. His name was Gideon Boone, and he looked like he had wrestled with trouble and made peace with it. His face was tan, jaw rough with stubble, but his eyes were soft. Too soft for a man traveling alone with a rifle tied to his saddle. He stopped outside the church where Beatrice was scrubbing the steps with lye water. She looked up once, then back down, brushing hard against the stone. "You missed a spot," he said, voice low and dry. She did not smile. "Then step over it." He did. He came back the next day, asking the preacher if he could help mend the broken fence around the churchyard. Then he fixed the pews. Then he offered to bring firewood. Then he started showing up wherever Beatrice happened to be. "Are you following me?" she asked one morning as she hung sheets behind the boarding house. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe this town is too small not to." Beatrice turned back to the sheets, the white fabric snapping between them. "You should not stand too close," she said. "People here think I bring bad luck." He tilted his head. "Do you?" She did not answer. Gideon leaned against the fence. "I do not scare easy." "You will." But he did not. He kept coming back, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with silence. He never asked about her past, never asked about her boys. He just stayed close like a shadow that wanted to be more than one. One afternoon, as a dust storm built on the horizon and people shuttered windows, Beatrice found herself standing in the church, lighting candles for no one in particular. Gideon walked in behind her, quiet as the wind. "Storm's coming," he said. She nodded. "I can feel it." He stepped closer. "You always light candles when the wind blows?" "I light them when I am afraid." "Are you afraid now?" She looked at him, her eyes dark and full. "Every day." Gideon stepped forward, closer than he ever had. "Then let me stand with you." The wind howled outside as the first gust of dust hit the windows. Beatrice's hands trembled. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you think you are cursed," he said softly. "And I have lived with my own ghosts long enough to know curses are just griefs that got too heavy." She turned her head, blinking fast. "You do not know what I lost." "No," he said, "but I can carry some of it if you let me." She looked up at him then, really looked, and for the first time in a long time, something inside her shifted. The storm passed by morning. The sky cleared, and when Beatrice walked into town, she did not walk alone. But Dry Creek did not forget. 3 boys threw rocks at her feet that week. 2 women turned their backs in church. And then, late one night, someone scrawled the word curse on the wall of the laundry house in pig's blood. Gideon reached her just as she was scrubbing it off, her hands red and raw. He took the brush from her. "Let them talk," he said. "I should leave," she answered. "It will only get worse." Gideon tossed the brush aside. "Then curse me too." She stared at him. "What?" "They say you are a curse. Well, I say curse me too. Let them think I am damned if they want. I do not care. I am not afraid of their whispers." Tears welled in her eyes. "Why?" "Because being near you feels like finally breathing again." She covered her face, shoulders shaking. Gideon stepped closer. He reached out slowly, fingers brushing hers. "Let me be yours. Let me stand beside you. No more hiding." Beatrice looked up, cheeks streaked wet. "I do not know how to begin again." He smiled, just enough to soften the grief between them. "Then we begin together." And that night, for the first time in years, she slept without waking to ghosts. The air turned cooler as autumn crept into the Arizona territory, the mesquite trees casting longer shadows across the hard-packed earth. Beatrice hung her washing later into the day, watching the light shift against the mountains, her hands chapped from the basin water, her shoulders carrying something unfamiliar, something almost like steadiness. Gideon had rented a bunk behind the blacksmith's shop, a lean space with a cot, a stove, and a sliver of a window that looked out onto the alley. He never spoke much about where he'd ridden from, only that he wasn't running anymore. Beatrice didn't ask. She learned more from his quiet than she ever had from words. One morning, he arrived at her door with a wooden box tucked under his arm. He held it out without explanation. "Open it," he said. Inside, there were brushes, a tin of linseed oil, and a half-used cake of yellow ochre. At the bottom, a folded rag held 3 stubby paint sticks. "They belong to my sister," he said. "She used to paint before the fever came through Yuma." Beatrice touched the brushes gently, thumb grazing the worn wood. "You want me to have them? I want you to use them. I don't paint." "You might." She closed the lid slowly. "Why give them to me?" Gideon looked at her for a long time. "Because you still see things, even when you pretend not to." That night, she sat by candlelight, staring at the brushes. Her fingers itched, but she didn't lift them. Not yet. The townsfolk kept their distance. At the mercantile, the shopkeeper served her in silence, shoulders stiff. At the church, the pew behind her sat empty every Sunday. She stopped trying to explain herself. She simply lived, and Gideon kept showing up. One afternoon, he found her mending a child's shirt that wasn't hers. "Where'd that come from?" he asked. "Left behind by a family passing through. The boy grew out of it, and his mother didn't want to carry what they didn't need. You kept it." Beatrice didn't look up. "I don't like waste." Gideon sat beside her on the step. "You still think about them," he said. She didn't speak. "I would," he added, "if I'd had sons." Beatrice's hands went still. "I never held them long enough," she said at last. "Zeke made it to the river. Zion didn't." Gideon waited. "I buried them with my own hands," she said, voice low. "No preacher, no pine box. Just stones and a prayer I don't even remember saying." The last thread in her needle snapped. He didn't touch her, just let the silence settle between them like dust on a porch rail. "They were mine," she said, "and the world swallowed them like they were nothing. You remember them." "I try. That's enough." She laid the mending aside, wiped her palms on her skirt. "I don't know if I believe that." "Then let me believe it for you." She looked at him then, really looked. His face was weathered from the sun, but his eyes held a kind of gentleness that wasn't born of ease. It was the kind that came from surviving something that had nearly taken him apart. They sat like that until the light changed. Later that week, she painted for the first time. The back of the laundry shed had a flat wall, bare and wide. She didn't ask permission. She just mixed the ochre with water and used the stiffest brush to shape the outline of a short-legged boy chasing a kite through imagined grass. She worked slowly, her wrist aching by noon, but she didn't stop. When Gideon found her, she had just begun to darken the boy's hair. He didn't say anything, just leaned against the fence and watched until the sun dipped low. That night he brought her a tin bowl of stew, still warm. "I saw what you started," he said. She nodded. "They had dark hair?" She nodded again. "They'd be proud of you. I don't know if they'd remember me." "They would." She set the bowl aside and folded her hands in her lap. "You stay," she said quietly, "even when it's easier not to." "I stay," he said, "because I want to. They'll never stop talking. Let them. You could ride on. Find someplace easier. I've had easier. Didn't feel like living." She turned her head toward him, and for the first time, there was something close to a smile at the edges of her mouth. "You want to stay," she said. "Really stay?" He reached out, not to pull her close but to rest his hand over hers. "I already have." The mural dried slow under the desert air, cracking slightly at the edges where the paint had soaked too deep into the wood. Beatrice didn't try to fix it. She left the imperfections as they were, like the boys had run through a brittle sun, their laughter caught in a place between memory and sky. Gideon passed by less during the day now, taking up work mending harnesses for a trail outfit hauling or south to Bisbee. He came back with his hands raw and his coat smudged with iron dust, his spine bent from hours over leather. But each evening, without needing to ask, he carried kindling for her stove and waited until she was done folding the last shirts at the boarding house. One dusk, she found him standing beside the mural, his hat in his hands. "You think of them when you look at it?" he asked, not turning. "No," she said. "I think of how I can't anymore." "That's worse." He nodded slowly. "I never knew what a child's voice sounded like close, just from a distance." She stepped beside him, arms crossed against the rising chill. "You had family?" "3 brothers. One made it past 17. "What happened?" "Rail ties gave out coming down from Santa Fe. He was on the crew. They say he never hollered, not even once." The wind tugged a curl loose from behind Beatrice's ear, and she didn't bother tucking it back. She said, "So many just vanish, and the world keeps turning." Gideon watched the painted boy's outstretched arm. "Maybe we keep turning too, just slower." They walked in silence after that, past the dying yucca and the cooling wash, until they reached her door. She paused with her hand on the latch. "Are you afraid of staying too long in one place?" she asked. He took a moment before answering. "I used to be. Thought if I kept writing, the bad parts wouldn't catch up." "Did it work?" "No. They just rode alongside me, waiting." She opened the door, letting the smell of soapstone and cedar drift out. Inside, the room was spare. A table, a tin basin, her boys' shirts folded in a box she never opened. She motioned him in. "I've never invited anyone here," she said. "I know." He stepped across the threshold, removing his boots without being told. The floor creaked beneath him, but the sound didn't startle either of them. "I was going to leave after the first week," she said, setting a pot to boil. "Didn't unpack until the 2nd month." "You unpacked now?" "I think I might have." She handed him a chipped cup of water, and he drank like he'd been waiting without knowing it. "Do you believe in forgiveness?" she asked suddenly. He set the cup down. "Not the kind that comes easy. But I believe in the kind that grows quiet and slow." I don't know if I deserve it. You do. You just haven't let yourself yet. A loose board creaked near the hearth. Neither of them moved to fix it. He said, I used to think peace was something you found out there, and pointed toward the window, where the hills lay dark and deep against the dusk. But maybe it's something you build, nail by nail. She nodded once. That's what I'm learning. They ate in silence, sharing cornbread and beans without apology. When he stood to leave, she didn't stop him, but she did follow him to the door. Outside, the moon hung low, caught behind a thin veil of cloud. He turned. I'll be back tomorrow. She didn't smile, but her voice held something new. I know. As he walked away, she leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, watching until he disappeared into the dark. And when she turned back inside, she didn't light the candle out of fear. She lit it because the room was becoming a place worth seeing clearly. By late November, the wind shifted from dry to cutting. The desert air sharpened at dusk, and dawn brought a brittle kind of cold that settled into joints and lingered in sleeves. Beatrice stitched lining into her only coat using scraps from an old flour sack, the letters Phoenix Milling, still faint across the inside seam. She didn't mind the oddness of it, it was warm, and that was enough. Gideon had taken to repairing tack in the evenings under the lean-to beside the smithy. His hands moved slow but sure over cracked leather, the light from his lantern casting long shadows across the packed dirt. Beatrice stopped by one evening with a jar of preserves she traded for prickly pear, thick and dark. He wiped his palms on a rag before taking it. You trade laundry for this? He asked, holding the jar up to the light. No, she said. I gave the widow Klein my last spool of red thread. She said it reminded her of Virginia. He turned the jar in his hand. That's a fair trade. She hesitated. I thought we might have it together, if you're not too tired. He nodded once. I'm not. They ate by lantern glow on a bench behind the blacksmith's. The preserves spread thin over hard biscuit. The quiet between them felt different now, looser, not waiting for something to break it. Beatrice set her empty plate down. I was 16 when I married. My father said it would keep me from starving. Gideon didn't interrupt. He had a mule with a bad shoulder and a wife who'd stopped speaking after her 5th birth. I think giving me away felt like selling off an extra weight. What was your husband like? He asked, his voice low. She leaned back against the fence post. He didn't like music or being touched when he was tired, but he never raised a hand, and he could build a fire in the rain. I thought that meant something. It does. She looked at him sideways. You ever been married? No. Ever wanted to? He pulled a splinter from the bench and tossed it into the dirt. I did once. What stopped you? She died before I could ask. Beatrice didn't press. She watched the lantern flicker. I still dream of them sometimes. The boys. Not their faces. Just the weight of them, one on each hip. He reached over, his hand resting beside hers on the bench. I'd like to know them, he said. Even just through you. She didn't move away. Zeke used to hum when he was scared, she said. Low, like a bee trapped in glass. Zion had a laugh that sounded like hiccups. Gideon's fingers brushed hers, slow and deliberate, as if asking rather than taking. She turned her palm upward and let his settle over it. The next morning, Gideon brought her a cedar box he'd built from leftover crates. It wasn't pretty, one hinge stuck, and the lid didn't sit flush, but it smelled of smoke and clean wood, and inside lay a folded scrap of tanned hide. She lifted it gently. What's this? He rubbed the back of his neck. I had a friend who rode with the Tonkawa. Said they stitched stories into leather when there weren't words. Beatrice unfolded the hide. It was blank. I thought maybe you could make your own, he said. Doesn't have to be much. Just something true. She ran her fingers over the soft grain. No one's ever asked me to tell my story. Not like this. I want to hear it, he said. Even the parts you don't say out loud. That night, she lit her lamp early and sat at her table, the hide before her, the smallest brush dipped in water-thinned paint. She didn't try to make it perfect, just honest. By the time the wick burned low, the hide bore a single line of ochre across its center, bending slightly left, like a trail winding into dusk. When he came the next day, she didn't speak. She just handed him the strip of leather. He looked down at the curve. What's it mean? She met his eyes. The way through, not straight. Not easy, but it leads somewhere. He exhaled, slow. You think we're on it? I think we could be. He let the hide roll into his palm, then tucked it into the pocket of his coat like a vow. Later that week, she found him mending a bridle with a child's whistle between his teeth, a carved reed, worn smooth. He took it out when she stepped closer. Found it by the creek, he said. Thought maybe it was left behind. She took it from his hand, looked it over. It's cracked. I know. Still makes a sound. She brought it to her lips, blew once thin and high, like wind through fence slats. Gideon smiled, quiet. There it is. She lowered it. It sounds lonely. Not anymore. He held out his hand, and she gave it back, the whistle warm from her breath. They stood together as the sun dipped behind the ridge, the day folding itself into the hush of near winter. Neither spoke of what had passed or what lay ahead. But when he reached for her fingers again, she let him take them hers, steady in his calloused grip. And this time, when they walked back toward her door, the path between them held no space for ghosts. The first frost came quiet, tracing the edges of the wash with a silver crust and stiffening the tips of wild grasses along the footpaths. Beatrice stood at her window before dawn, arms wrapped around herself as the last stars faded. The stove had gone cold in the night, but she hadn't woken to feed it. For the first time in years, sleep had held her gently. By the time the sun reached the top of the ridge, Gideon was already knocking the dirt from his boots outside her door. You're early, she said, letting him in. I couldn't wait. He carried a folded paper, creased sharp along the edges. The preacher gave me this. Said we'd need it signed by 2 witnesses. She took it slowly, eyes brushing across the words. Marriage license. I didn't want to ask you with a crowd watching. Didn't seem right. She traced the edge of the paper with her thumb. You're sure? I've never been more. She set the paper on the table and looked at him full, her voice steady. Then I am too. They married 3 days later, beneath the cottonwood tree behind the church. No flowers, no music. Just the preacher's voice, 2 neighbors to sign, and the feel of Gideon's hand in hers as if it had always been there. Afterward, they shared a meal under the tree, coffee, bread, and a jar of the last of the preserves. Beatrice wore her coat with the flour sack lining, and Gideon had shaved for the first time in a week. There was no celebration, but there was peace, quiet and true. That night, she led him inside her house, and he removed his boots by the door like always. The cot he'd slept on behind the smithy sat empty, his few belongings tucked in a canvas bag by his side. She took it from him without fuss and set it near the wash basin. You don't have to sleep in the corner, she said, not smiling, but close. I know. He set the bag down and stepped close, his hand resting light at her waist. She leaned into him, not out of need but choice. You're home now, she said. In the weeks that followed, the townsfolk kept their distance, but the stares faded. No more words scrawled in blood. No more stones. Mrs. Klein brought a bundle of wool scraps for quilting and said nothing about the past. The preacher began nodding when he passed. The town didn't forget, but it began to forgive in its own slow way. Beatrice painted again, this time not on boards, but scraps of hide stitched into a square. A wheel, a bird, a narrow river twisting through hills. Stories stitched not of grief, but of endurance. Gideon built her a bench beside the stove, where she could work in warmth. He carved her name into the side, not deep, but enough to last. One morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and found him already dressed, a small box in his hands. "I made something for you," he said. Inside, wrapped in scrap muslin, lay a carved comb inlaid with a narrow band of copper. The teeth were smooth, the shape curved gentle to her palm. "I noticed you use a fork," he said, sheepish. She turned it over in her hand, then reached up and slid it through her hair, secure and clean. "It's perfect," she said. He watched her a long moment, then reached for her hand. "You know, I never thought I'd end up anywhere. Didn't think I deserved it." She squeezed his fingers. "Neither did I. But here we are." Winter came down hard that year, snow touching the high ridge and frost biting through the shutters at night. They kept warm with quilts and each other, the days slow and full. Gideon repaired boots and bridles at the table, and Beatrice stitched her painted hides into a coverlet that grew heavy with color. In time, a neighbor's girl came in the afternoons to learn sewing. Then another. Beatrice didn't charge, just asked them to bring something to mend. They came with torn hems and loose buttons, and left with stories stitched into cloth small, quiet things that made them linger a little longer each time. Gideon fixed the school bell that had hung silent for 3 winters. When he rang it, the sound was rough but true. One evening, as the wind laid down and the fire dimmed, Beatrice set her sewing aside and leaned into him. "I've been thinking," she said. He waited. "Maybe we should build on out back. Just one room," she said. "Enough for what might come." He turned to her, brows drawn. "You think?" "I don't know," she said softly. "But I want to be ready." He kissed her then, slow and certain, his hand against her cheek. "We'll be ready," he said. Years later, folks would still speak of the quiet woman who painted stories in leather and the man who rode into town and never left. They'd say the house on the rise had warm light even in the coldest months, and that laughter sometimes drifted from the open window small and high, like hiccups caught on the wind. But Beatrice and Gideon didn't care what was said. They knew what they'd built. Not a perfect life, but a true one, stitched together from loss and slow-earned trust, warmed by quiet hands and the kind of love that didn't need proving. And when spring finally came, early and full, they sat beneath the cottonwood, their fingers laced, the land around them green with promise.